He transformed the guitar, inspired generations, and redefined rock itself. But beneath Eddie Van Halen's devilish smile and solos that defied the mind were rivalries that few knew existed. There were 6 guitarists he emulated, battled with, and sometimes couldn't stand. What fueled this secret tension among legends? And why did some of rock's all-time biggest names find themselves on Eddie's secret hate list? Come along as we learn the 6 guitarists Eddie Van Halen despised most. Number 6, Eric Clapton. Prior to Eruption, prior to the wailing groups of people, a young Eddie Van Halen sat in his Pasadena bedroom with a bargain basement guitar and a dog-eared stack of Cream albums. Night after night, he laid the needle on crossroads, attempting to get every bend and burning lick off Eric Clapton's Les Paul. Clapton wasn't only an influence, he was why Eddie learned to play the guitar. He once said to Guitar World, "Clapton was my biggest influence. I'd sit there for hours trying to work out what he was doing. I'd play that solo on Crossroads note for note. He was God to me." In those formative years, Eddie didn't concern himself with fame or tone or songwriting. He was concerned with figuring out what made Clapton's playing alive. The phrasing, the sustain, and the space informed his musical DNA. But time has a way of altering everything. By the late 1970s, Eddie Van Halen had accomplished something even Clapton hadn't. He revolutionized the electric guitar. When Eruption struck, it sounded as if it were from another planet. His two-handed tapping, harmonic squeals, and dive bombs rewrote guitar technique. Overnight, this bashful boy from Pasadena was the future of rock. Fans adored him, but not everyone applauded. The old guard, musicians Eddie once idolized, listened with suspicion. In 1980, when Clapton was questioned about Van Halen, he replied in a way that surprised Eddie. Clapton made the comment, "He's very good technically, but I don't hear much soul." It was a careless comment, but a cutting one. For Eddie, it was a heartbreak. The guy who had influenced his playing now rejected his music as mechanical. Years later, he confessed, "It kind of broke my heart. I learned everything from him. I wasn't trying to outplay him. I was inspired by him. To hear that he didn't like what I was doing really got to me." Eddie never retaliated. He never went out of his way to criticize Clapton in interviews. But friends indicate that he quietly struggled with the letdown and how odd it felt to be turned down by his idol. Some of the conflict was philosophical. Clapton's playing was constructed on restraint, a blues-based style where tone and phrasing spoke the language. Eddie's was freedom, distortion, feedback, and unapologetic experimentation. In a way, they symbolized 2 generations. Clapton, the music of the 60s. Eddie, the music of the future. But even amidst the agony, the respect never wavered. In 1995, Eddie confessed Clapton's tone on Crossroads, "That's still untouchable. I don't care what anybody says. That's pure feeling. You can't fake that." The 2 men finally sat down together in Los Angeles during the mid-1980s. Eddie was excited, as a fan greeting his hero for the first time. Clapton was courteous but aloof. They spoke of guitars, tone, and amplifiers, but not of feeling. Later, Eddie reported to a friend, "He's just a man. I think I love the myth more than the person." That made him. That was when Eddie ceased thinking of legends as gods and began to think of them as humans, great but imperfect. Later, when questioned whether Clapton's words still grated, Eddie chuckled, "Nah, perhaps he didn't understand. Perhaps I didn't understand him either. We're from different planets, man." That sentence summed them both up. 2 guitar deities from 2 worlds. Clapton worked with blues and silhouettes. Eddie splattered color across the horizon. Since Eddie's death in 2020, Clapton has been said to have talked affectionately about him in private, referring to him as a true innovator. Although he never made a public comment, those who were familiar with their tale recognized the gesture. By then, Eddie had come to terms with it long ago. In 2001, he informed Guitar World, "If Clapton hadn't existed, neither would I. Whatever he thinks of me doesn't change that." By the end, Eddie's respect hadn't faded. It had evolved. "I'll always be pursuing what I heard on those old Cream records," he once said. That's where the fire started. Eddie's heartache with Clapton was deep, but his next rivalry seethed hotter. This was not disappointment. It was straight-up rivalry. Two guitar gods on one stage with no quarter to be asked for. What happens when Eddie Van Halen confronts the dark wizard of the Stratocaster? Number 5. Ritchie Blackmore. Few experiences are more anxiety-provoking for a young guitarist than the encounter with a hero, and particularly so when the hero is Ritchie Blackmore, Deep Purple's and Rainbow's moody, tempestuous genius. For teenage Eddie Van Halen, Blackmore was no mere rock star. He was a visionary of tone. Eddie would learn Burn and Highway Star note for note, playing them until his fingers were bleeding. He envied the accuracy of jazz's solos, the cut of his distortion, and that eerie feeling of drama that hovered over every riff. For Eddie, Ritchie was one of the select few who could get a guitar to sound alive. When Van Halen's debut album exploded in 1978, Eddie suddenly found himself standing alongside the men he'd grown up idolizing. He was no longer a kid with a Strat copy in his bedroom. He was a peer, a chart-topping guitarist rewriting the rules of rock. But the dream soured quickly when he finally met one of his gods. During a 1982 interview with guitar players Jazz Obrecht, Eddie remembered their first meeting. "He just stared at me," Eddie recalled. "Wouldn't say hi, nothing. I was crushed. I thought, wow, I admired this guy my entire life, and he just blew me off." That silence struck harder than any insult. Eddie was not arrogant. He was disarmingly candid, a fellow who could go on and on about gear and pickup wiring for hours. He jammed with anyone and laughed freely. What remained with him about Ritchie was the chill, the vacant stare, the absence of warmth, the complete lack of rapport. Years later, Eddie mentioned it again. "People like Joe Perry and Ritchie Blackmore just gave me the shaft with their eyes," he told Rock and Roll Garage. "Wouldn't say hello. Wouldn't be nice. No, nothing. I'm not that way." That line, "the shaft with their eyes," captured the bite exactly. Eddie had just released Eruption, a solo that exploded guitar playing and made every rock musician question what was possible. But his idols, the men whose posters used to decorate his room, eyed him with something less than rivalry, disdain. Some of it was Ritchie's personality. Blackmore was notoriously difficult, even to his own band members. His aura relied on remoteness. And when interviewed decades later about what he thought of Van Halen, his answer was both compliment and jab. "He's a fine player," Blackmore replied, "but I think he plays too many notes." Fans debated years ago over that line. Was it jealousy or old-fashioned snobbery? Actually, it hinted at a deeper split within the break between two generations of rock guitar. Blackmore's music was influenced by classical phrasing and restraint. Each bend and vibrato was calculated. Eddie's music was the opposite, fluid, explosive, and uncontrolled. Where Ritchie built control, Eddie represented freedom. It wasn't so much a feud, rather a generation standoff. Eddie was the figurehead of a new revolution. The Californian creators who rewired their amplifiers, constructed their own guitars, and pursued tones nobody had previously experienced. Blackmore was the last bastion of the austere British hard rock purists, his fretwork based in accuracy and structure. Yet, Eddie never allowed that chill meeting to become bitterness. In a 1995 Guitar World interview, he remembered with empathy, "I was probably just too sensitive back then. Maybe he was shy or didn't know what to say. But man, I worshipped that guy growing up. Still do." And eventually, even Ritchie mellowed. In 2008, he explained to Classic Rock magazine, "Eddie Van Halen introduced something new. I can't dispute that. What he did using the whammy bar, the tapping, it was clever. He discovered his own voice. It was recognition, the same thing Eddie had longed for. They went their separate ways, but they remained tied by influence." Blackmore wandered into Renaissance music and medieval ballads with Blackmore's Night, pursuing beauty instead of brutality. Eddie remained restless, always fiddling with guitars and tone circuits, pursuing the sound nobody else could hear. And he did. When the world lost Eddie Van Halen in 2020, even devoted Blackmore enthusiasts had come to accept what their idol finally confessed. He was brilliant. He found something that everyone else was trying to find. The words were decades too late, but for Eddie Van Halen, they were sufficient. But Eddie was about to experience another type of rejection, a loud, swaggering, attitude-soaked one. Number 4. Joe Perry. Van Halen in 1978 was the new storm sweeping over rock's horizon, raw, charged, and impossible to overlook. The band's initial album had just started to rattle the airwaves, and Eddie Van Halen, who was hardly 23, remained the hungry teenager from Pasadena struggling to establish that he belonged to the ranks of guitar gods. Every evening on the road, he shredded solos,